The mud was the first thing to kill them. It wasn't the arrows. Not yet. It was the mud. October 25, 1415. Agincourt. 6,000 Englishmen, starving, dysenteric, and trembling with fever, stood against the might of the French nobility. The French knights, they were the finest in Christendom. Clad in plate armor that cost more than a peasant would earn in 10 lifetimes. They were the tanks of the medieval world. Invincible. Or so they thought. But that day the sky turned black. Not with clouds but with wood and iron. In the span of a few hours the flower of French chivalry didn't just die. They were slaughtered like cattle in a pen. Crushed by the weight of their own armor, drowned in the mud, and pierced by the weapon that would rewrite the rules of war forever, the English longbow. This wasn't just a battle. It was the brutal climax of a feud that had already bled Europe dry for nearly 80 years. A feud we call the 100 Years' War. But to understand the end we must go back to the beginning. To a time when kings treated nations like personal property, and the ego of two men set the world on fire. 1337. Europe is a spiderweb of marriages and bloodlines. Imagine a family dinner where everyone hates each other, but everyone owns a piece of everyone else's house. That was the relationship between England and France. The King of England, Edward III, was technically a vassal to the King of France, Philip VI. Why? Because Edward owned Gascony, a massive wine-rich region in southwest France. Think about that. A king, kneeling to another king. Edward III was young, ambitious, and frankly tired of kneeling. When Philip VI threatened to confiscate Gascony, Edward didn't just refuse. He did the unthinkable. He declared that he was the rightful king of France. It was a legal technicality, a claim through his mother, but it was enough to turn a diplomatic dispute into total war. Philip laughed. The French court laughed. England was a small island backwater. France was the superpower of medieval Europe. Richer, larger, more populous. They stopped laughing in 1340. The Battle of Sluys. It wasn't fought on a field but on the sea. The French fleet had chained their ships together, creating a floating wooden wall across the harbor mouth. A fortress on the water. A terrible mistake. Edward's fleet maneuvered with the wind. The English archers, remember this because it's a pattern, rained death from the decks. The French couldn't move. They were trapped on their own floating platforms. By sunset, the water was so thick with corpses that it was said the fish would speak French for years to come. The English had won the Channel. The invasion had begun. But the true turning point, the moment the medieval world cracked, came 6 years later. 1346. Crecy. This is where the legend begins. Edward III was retreating. His army was small, tired, and cornered by the massive French host. But Edward chose his ground carefully. He placed his men on a ridge. And he deployed his secret weapon. The longbow. 6 feet of yew wood. It required immense strength to draw, over 100 pounds of force. It could punch through chainmail at 200 yards. The French sent out their crossbowmen. Genoese mercenaries. Professionals. But their crossbows were slow. Wet from the rain. Then Edward gave the signal. Release. It wasn't a battle. It was an execution. The French knights, furious at the retreat of their mercenaries, charged through their own men to get to the English. Blind arrogance. They rode straight into a storm of arrows. Horses panicked. Knights fell and couldn't get up. The English infantry just walked among the fallen, slipping knives through the visors of the helpless nobility. That day the concept of chivalry, war as a gentleman's game, died in the mud of Crecy. From the ashes of Crecy rose a figure of nightmares. Edward's son. The Black Prince. He didn't care about conquering land. He cared about breaking the French spirit. He launched the chevauchee raids of terror. Burning villages, destroying crops, slaughtering peasants. It was total war. Economic warfare. France was burning. And its king John II, who succeeded Philip, was desperate to stop the bleeding. 1356. Poitiers. History repeated itself. Another hill. Another storm of arrows. Another disaster for France. But this time the catastrophe was absolute. King John II wasn't just defeated. He was captured. Imagine the chaos. The King of France, a prisoner in London. The country fell into anarchy. Without a head, the body began to convulse. In 1360, The Treaty of Bretigny was signed. England had won. They owned a third of France. The war should have been over. But fate has a cruel sense of humor. Just as England reached its peak, an invisible enemy arrived at the shores of Europe. An enemy that carried no flag, respected no borders, and killed without mercy. The Black Death. The English had won the war. But nature decided to reset the board. The Black Death didn't care about treaties. It didn't care if you were English or French. It arrived like a thief in the night, carried by fleas on the backs of rats. In just a few years, it wiped out nearly half the population of Europe. Imagine walking down your street and every second house is a tomb. No soldiers to fight. No peasants to harvest the wheat. The economy collapsed. The war paused not because of peace, but because there was no one left to hold a sword. And from this death came rage. The peasants, having watched their lords fail to protect them from the English and fail to protect them from the plague, rose up. The Jacquerie in France. The peasants' revolt in England. The nobility realized something terrifying. They were outnumbered. The war became a three-way struggle. England versus France versus the common man. Amidst this chaos, France found a brain. King Charles V, known as the Wise. He looked at the disasters of Crecy and Poitiers and realized a hard truth. We cannot beat the English in a field. So he hired a bulldog. Bertrand du Guesclin. A knight who wasn't pretty, wasn't chivalrous, and didn't play by the rules. Du Guesclin waged a guerrilla war. He ambushed supply lines. He liberated towns at night. He refused to give the English the one thing they wanted, a big battle. Slowly, methodically, France clawed its land back. By 1380 the English were pushed back to the coast. But empires are fragile things. When Charles the Wise died, he left the throne to his son, Charles VI. At first they called him the Beloved. Soon they would call him the Mad. 1392. On a sunny day while riding with his army, Charles VI suddenly drew his sword and attacked his own men, screaming of betrayal. It was the first snap. For the rest of his life, the King of France drifted in and out of insanity. There were months where he refused to wash. Months where he didn't know his name. And most terrifying of all, he believed he was made of glass. He wore iron rods in his clothes to prevent himself from shattering. He wouldn't let anyone touch him. France was paralyzed. A ship with a broken rudder, drifting in a storm. The nobles, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, started a civil war for control of the Mad King. They tore France apart from the inside. And across the channel, a new shark smelled the blood in the water. Enter Henry V. He was not like his father. He was not like the Mad King of France. He was cold. He was pious. And he was utterly ruthless. He didn't just want land. He believed, with every fiber of his being, that God had ordained him to be the King of France. In 1415 he landed in Normandy. He captured Harfleur, but it cost him. Dysentery, the bloody flux, ravaged his army. He lost thousands. He decided to march to Calais to go home. It was supposed to be a simple march. But the French were waiting. Agincourt. It is the most famous battle in medieval history. But we often forget how desperate it was. Henry had maybe 6,000 men. Mostly archers. Starving. Sick. Facing them? The full might of the French army. 20,000? 30,000? Historians argue the numbers, but the reality was clear. The English were going to die. The night before the battle, the French nobles gambled for the English prisoners they hadn't even caught yet. They celebrated. The English, they prayed. And they sharpened stakes. October 25th, St. Crispin's Day. The field was a plowed strip of land between two heavy forests. And it had rained all night. The ground was a soup of thick, clinging clay. The French, confident in their armor, attacked. It was a slow-motion disaster. As the French knights charged, they hit the mud. They slowed to a crawl, knee-deep in clay. Then came the arrow storm. The French lowered their visors to protect their eyes. But this made them blind. They pressed forward, pushed by the men behind them. They were packed so tight they couldn't lift their arms to swing their swords. It wasn't a fight. It was a crush. Men didn't die from wounds. They died from suffocation. Crushed upright by the weight of the dead and the living. When the piles of bodies were hip-high, the English archers dropped their bows. They picked up hammers, axes, and daggers. Lightly armored, They danced over the mud while the French knights drowned in it. Then, a moment of horror. Fearing a counterattack, Henry V gave an order that shocked the conscience of the age. Kill the prisoners. Hundreds of noble French knights, surrendered and helpless, were butchered in cold blood. It was a war crime by modern standards. It was survival by Henry's. By evening, the flower of French nobility lay dead in the mud. England had lost a few hundred men. France had lost a generation. Agincourt broke France. 5 years later, the Treaty of Troyes was signed. It was the total capitulation of the French crown. Charles VI, the Mad King, signed away his son's inheritance. He declared Henry V his heir. Henry married the French princess Catherine. He had done it. Henry V was effectively the King of England and France. The dual monarchy was real. The war was finally won. But death is the one conqueror Henry couldn't defeat. Just 2 years after his greatest triumph, at the age of 35, Henry V died. Not in battle, but of dysentery, a soldier's disease. And 2 months later, the Mad King Charles VI died too, leaving the two greatest nations in Europe in the hands of a baby. The stage was set for the miracle. 1429. France was dead. The English held Paris. They held the north. They laid siege to Orleans, the gateway to the south. The Dauphin, Charles VII, the man who should have been king, was hiding in Chinon, uncrowned, broke, hopeless. His advisors told him to flee to Scotland or Spain. It was over. And then, a peasant girl walked out of the forest. Joan of Arc, Jeanne d'Arc. She was 17. She couldn't read. She couldn't write. She had never held a sword. But she claimed she heard the voices of saints. Saint Michael. Saint Catherine. They told her one thing: drive the English out. Crown the king. The court laughed at her. They tested her virginity. They tested her sanity. But in her eyes they saw something they hadn't seen in 100 years. Belief. Desperate, Charles gave her armor. He gave her a banner. And he sent her to Orleans. The English soldiers were tough veterans. They feared nothing, except the devil. And when they saw this girl in white armor riding at the front of the charge, unhurt by arrows, scaling ladders while holding a banner, they panicked. They thought she was a witch. The French thought she was a saint. In 9 days she did what generals hadn't done in 9 months. She lifted the siege of Orleans. She dragged the Dauphin to Reims, deep in enemy territory, and stood beside him as he was crowned King Charles VII. It was impossible. It was a miracle. But the medieval world hated powerful women. 1430 she was captured. Not by the English but by the Burgundians who sold her to the English. They put her on trial in Rouen. It wasn't a trial, it was theater. They needed to prove she was a heretic to delegitimize the king she had crowned. They asked her trap questions. Do you know you are in God's grace? If she said yes, it was heresy, claiming to know God's mind. If she said no, she confessed her guilt. She answered, if I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God so keep me. It didn't matter. They burned her anyway. They threw her ashes into the Seine River so no relics would remain. They thought killing the girl would kill the dream. They were wrong. They had just created a martyr. Joan woke the French spirit. But it was bureaucracy that won the war. 1435. The Congress of Arras. The Duke of Burgundy, tired of the English alliance, switched sides. Suddenly England lost its foothold. Paris opened its gates to the French king. And while England was busy fighting amongst itself, the beginnings of the War of the Roses, France was modernizing. Enter the Bureau brothers. Jean and Gaspard Bureau. They weren't knights. They were engineers. And they brought a new god to the battlefield. Gunpowder. For a century the longbow had been the king of the battlefield. But the longbow takes a lifetime to master. A cannon takes an afternoon. The French army became a professional machine. No more feudal levies. A standing army paid by taxes, supported by artillery. The English held on for 20 more years, but they were fighting the future. July 17, 1453. Castillon. The final battle. John Talbot, the Earl of Shrewsbury. He was 66 years old. The English Achilles. He represented everything the war used to be. Bravery. Aggression. Chivalry. He heard reports that the French were retreating. He charged his men forward, expecting another Agincourt. But the French weren't retreating. They were entrenched. And waiting for him were 300 cannons. It wasn't a battle. It was a massacre. Talbot charged the guns. His horse was hit by a cannonball. He fell, and a French archer finished him with an axe. With Talbot died the English Empire in France. Bordeaux fell. The English sailed home, leaving behind everything except the port of Calais. After 116 years, the guns fell silent. 116 years. 5 generations of men. Millions dead. What was it all for? The map of 1453 looked remarkably similar to the map of 1337. But the soul of Europe had changed. England and France were no longer just properties of monarchs. They were nations. The war forged identities. Before this, you were a Norman, a Gascon, or a Yorkshireman. Now you were French. You were English. You hated the other side, and in that hatred you found yourself. The knight was dead. The longbow was retired. The age of gunpowder had begun. The feudal system was broken by the plague and the cost of war. The Middle Ages were ending. The modern world was waking up. It started with a dispute over a patch of land. It ended with the birth of the Europe we know today. But in the quiet fields of France, if you listen closely to the wind, you can still hear the echo of the arrow that killed chivalry. Documenting a century of conflict is a battle in itself. If this journey through the mud of Agincourt and the flames of Rouen sparked something in you, consider joining our ranks. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. It's the only way to ensure you're on the front lines for our next deep dive into the forgotten chapters of history. The YouTube algorithm, much like the French heavy cavalry, can be stubborn. A simple like on this video is the longbow arrow that helps us break through and share these stories with the world. So please strike true. And tell us in the comments below, was Henry V a tactical genius or a ruthless war criminal? We read every debate. Thank you for watching. History is not just in the past, it's being rediscovered right now. See you in the next era.